I would yell, but I've been in 301 for 2 days. We're taking a day off to honor the one and only Ken Hover. And it's a pleasure to be part of this program, so thank you for having me and inviting me, Michael. I've known Ken since November 1st, 1999, my first day of PCA. I came to the Baltimore Convention, and it was a very cold November, and my boss said I had to meet Ken Hover. So I sought him out. I was shy. I know you can't picture that. This is 25 years later. But I was very shy back then, very intimidated. And I found him and I introduced myself and I told him I was going to be at World of Concrete to hear all his sessions because I was told he was the best speaker in our industry. And I was told the correct information. So Ken was kind enough to talk to me for at least 10 minutes in my first introduction with him, which to get 10 minutes of Ken's time at ACI, you know how valuable that is. And that was 25 plus years ago. And a lot has happened in our relationship since then. I've had the pleasure of working with him at PCA in many different ways. So I have some bribes. I like to bribe people too. I don't have candy. But if the first person who can tell everyone in this room what Ken has contributed to PCA, I have a little prize for you. So just a question, do you think it was research? Do you think it was in the education field, which he's very well known for, or as an author?
All the above.
And there he goes. So since he answered it correctly, but I have a feeling he already owns this, and if he doesn't, he'll give it to the appropriate person at Baker. But yes, of course, it's all of the above. He's the one and only Ken, and he has done a lot for PCA, and I've had the pleasure of working with him in many of those areas. So I'm going to go over some of his contributions to PCA, but also in those 25 plus years, what he did to encourage me through all those processes, aid PCA in putting together wonderful programs and research and fellowships. But also there are some nuances about Ken that some of you in this room maybe have had the pleasure of dealing with, and not just on ACI committees. So as a researcher, I had just joined PCA when he put together this bulletin, and you already heard about it actually. When you heard about the freeze-thaw research that then turned into the ACI 318 durability exposure criteria, that was part of PCA's research as well. And we in the design and control referenced this research as part of the freeze-thaw chapter and part of the durability chapter as well. So it's a very well-known publication. If you haven't read it, you can get it for free in our library. We don't charge for everything at PCA, just cement and the design and control. But if you go to our library, you can get this research bulletin. It's excellent. It is the foundation for the durability parameters, and it vets them. So he went through a lot of information there on it, and it tells you information that Colin and I argue about all the time of whether or not the water-cement ratio can go up to 0.5 or if it should stay at 0.45, and you know 318 is a conservative code, but my driveway was below 0.45 because I also don't want scaling. So, you know, we're conservative in our industry, but you do have the ability when you read literature and read research to know that we could probably expand those boundaries, and that's already been vetted. So that was really important to us, and we care very much about air entrainment. We care very much about freeze-thaw resistance for concrete, and Ken vetted that for us. So we thank him very much for it, and I think most people in this room know that when you think of air entrainment, you think of Ken. So, but one thing Ken also says constantly in his presentations, if you know him well enough, there's always more to tell. So the "but wait, there's more" is a Ken Hover. So that is the theme of my presentation, is that he hasn't just done one thing for PCA. He's done many, and they've come up with many different Kenisms, which you'll hear from Bruno and others throughout the day. But the pleasure I've had working with Ken is not just on ACI committees. The way that our friendship grew was from knowing similar people and having fun with them as well, but it was really our work together with this professor workshop that had started in the late 90s when I came on board at PCA. And Ken was one of our primary presenters. And one thing that happened with the professor workshop is it was a materials engineering workshop with the premier professors in our industry. And if people wonder why I stayed at PCA for 25 years, it's for that reason, that I got to work with Ken, that I got to work with David Lang, that I got to work with Michael Thomas. They would come every summer and present at this workshop. And many of you in the room maybe attended it when you were students as well. But Ken had a special way about him in the materials session. And one of the coolest things about this workshop was it wasn't just learning their presentation styles and learning from them on the subject matter for some of the newer professors in the industry. It was that they shared their syllabi. They shared their method of teaching as peer-to-peer with the people in this industry. And just watching them explain all that, it was amazing to see that. But that's not really why I enjoyed my time. It's because one of my obligations, besides making sure Ken was there for his keynote and that his flight was on time and that everything else worked out, was that I would pick him up in my rusty Honda Element at the airport, often late, and I would pick him up and he'd be standing there, and we would go drop his stuff at the hotel. But the first stop we always made was to the Jewel Osco to get Ken's supplies, because Ken needs his teaching supplies, which you'll see later today. So we spent a lot of time searching the hallways of the Jewel Osco for Velveeta. And what we would learn is that depending on who the stocking person was, they had a different definition of whether or not Velveeta is cheese or it's imitation cheese. So each year we would be searching for the Velveeta, and we couldn't necessarily find the Velveeta. So this would seriously take like a half an hour. But it turned into a giggle fest. It turned into quite the adventures as we would search for it. But that was one of our favorite things to do, and we may have added a few other things to our shopping list depending on where Michelle was in her week. I might be getting my own groceries as well, but it all worked out. So there is a lot more that Ken has done for PCA, and I've worked with Ken on many authored publications that maybe we published, and maybe I just mined the data and put it in design and control, because Ken actually worked on the next edition of the Air Manual that we didn't publish, but we took that information that he had written and put it into the design and control. So he has put a lot of information there, but he's also hosted a lot of PCA Fellow education winners. And so PCA Foundation has fellowships for students, and Ken's students have had a pleasure of getting many of those. But the ones that we've used quite a bit in our publications are on thermal imaging, and then also on frost resistance. So those are also quoted in the design and control. And we appreciate any professor in our industry that brings students into our industry. But of course, when Ken's their professor, we know they're going to stay in concrete. So that's been part of his legacy. But where I worked the closest with him, besides the PCA Professors Workshop, was on things that Ken has done for the design and control. You know, his name's not on the front page, but it basically should be. Back in 2002, when I was very new at PCA, Ken took a lot of data from the Corps of Engineers and many other research publications, including ACI 211's mixed design, and he took fundamental knowledge and he turned them into practical tables and graphs. So the way that information had been distributed prior might not have been as easy to read, as easy to grasp, and he has a way about him of turning it into something that you can just see the information right before you. So he did a lot of work on tables and graphs for design and control, and he also, of course, reviewed many chapters. So Ken and I have spent hours, if not days, talking about design and control over the phone. During COVID, I think we spent about 2 days straight on the curing chapter, making sure that it had the right information for our industry in it, and it's input like I get from Ken that makes our documents better for the industry. But also he has a way about him that you may not know, and it's very important to know this. Ken will see if you're reading what he's putting, and instead of it being a bubble, like a track changes thing that any normal human would do, Ken will color code his documents, and then he will put little jokes in between his review comments that are in the body of the document. So you need to read the entire document and mine out his jokes that he's only writing for you as well. And it actually makes it a much better review process for me as well, to get a little humor in between a valid point that he's making. So he's done quite a bit of that over the years, and I remember the many times I would go into Steve Kosmatka and say, I almost missed this one. Because you start seeing the normal language and not. So cleaning it up was always fun, but he really helped our documents. I mean, we have a lot of great information on initial curing. Everyone should know how Ken feels about the psychometric chart and where its beginnings came from. So things like that are very important for the future of our industry. But there is so much more that Ken has done. And I think it's important to be aware of that. And I think if anyone knows Ken, they know he is the most practical person in the world. He is going to state what is right there in front of you for you, because you're probably not observing it. One of the things that I think is the best compliment that Ken ever got, that he probably didn't even hear, was at one of the professor workshops where he was wowing everyone in the audience. And I was in the back row with Kevin Folliard and Mike Thomas. And Mike just looked up at you, looked over at us and goes, I wish I would have been Ken's student. And that's, seriously, your peers worshiping you is almost as good as all your Cornell students worshiping you. And you are one of the most practical people in the world to be able to explain information that is complex in a way that everybody can appreciate concrete, because not everyone appreciates concrete. But there's one more thing that you may or may not know about Ken, and that's that he has an affinity for good food. And if you try and bribe him by bringing him to a fancy Italian restaurant with white tablecloths, he will tell you about how unhappy he is that he's at the fancy restaurant with the white tablecloths when he could be at his favorite restaurant in Chicago. And where is your favorite restaurant, Ken?
Claim Company.
It is. He loves the Claim Company, and he loves the Claim Company because the first time we went there was with my better half, Joe, and Joe taught him about the mother lode. And what is it about the mother lode that's so special?
The Merck cheese.
That's right. So Merck's cheese is a Wisconsin cheese. This is a Wisconsin accent. It is something that's actually gone out of business, but they made enough of it. Again, it might be a question of, is it cheese or is it a spread? But you usually get it at the holidays in some sort of cheese ball fashion. But this is a basket of various flavors of Merck's cheese for you. But Ken has a very specific taste, and it is very much about cheese, and it's also very much about chips and other things. But if you put Merck's cheese on top of a burger, you're hitting somewhere close to heaven. Wouldn't you agree? So I have many more things I could say about our years together, but I'm keeping it clean, and I'll be moderating the afternoon session, and it's just an honor to work with you, sir, and an honor to learn from you. Thank you for everything you've done for us.